Earlier today, I had a wonderful chance to sit down and have a discussion with philosopher Jason Brennan. We talked in particular about a book by another philosopher, Harry Brighouse. It's a book called On Education, and particularly we talked about chapter 4, where Harry Brighouse makes an argument on what he thinks the three things are schools need to do to create good citizens. One, creating them a disposition to follow the law. Number two, creating them a disposition to use public channels to further causes of social justice. And number three, in public discourse, to exercise a certain type of civility that might be called public reason liberalism. We talked about those point by point, expressing some disagreement and some possible problem areas with Brighouse's approach. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit more generally in the chapter. We're going to talk about things like whether or not something being valuable is enough to say schools should teach it. And even getting into issues of Brighouse's indication that he would favor laws abolishing private schools. So we're going to talk about all those things and more. Those of you who have the book, of course, can follow along. Those of you who don't may profit from the discussion anyway. Yeah, and then you also, when we were talking to kind of prepare for this, you had talked about kind of the is-ought distinction. There's a difference between maybe what is important and valuable and what and I guess the facts of the matter in terms of, okay, it might be valuable to teach kids this, but we still have to question, are schools the best place to do that? And in some ways, in several chapters, I mean, he brings up the distinction in other chapters, but he doesn't really bring it up in a way that needs to be done. So the example I like to give is, okay, a lot of people would argue that religion is a really important thing that students should have by the time they get out of school. But it's a very controversial position, probably rightly so, that schools, and particularly public schools, are therefore sanctioned to teach it.
I mean, imagine I wrote a similar chapter where I had all these criteria and I said, this is what students need to be delivered, and the vehicle by which they have to be delivered is your car radio. You think that's kind of crazy, right? Because it's not a good way of delivering it. So you want to start by asking, just because you have these goals, like you want students to believe that, you want people to believe certain things and behave in certain ways and be disposed to do certain things, that leaves open the question of why any particular set of institutions is the vehicle by which those things should be delivered. Maybe education isn't the right tool for the job. Maybe education is a hammer and he's looking for a screwdriver. I think you'd want to start by asking, what is education actually able to do? That should be like the first question. What are you actually able to do with education? Then once you figure out what you're able to do with it, then you might look and ask, well, what are the things among the things we're able to do with it, what are the things that we should do with it? And what are the things we shouldn't do with it? He kind of starts, as far as I can tell, by asking, what do I want education to do? And then the question of whether it's actually able to do it never really crosses his mind or isn't given serious consideration. And related to this point, I wanted to talk about, because I think it segues into this, he at one point says that he thinks there's a substantial case to be made for forbidding private schools, and that forbidding private schools is good for public schools. And
so let me just stop there and just give a reference to people who may be following along. I believe that was, I don't know the page numbers, but that was close to where it was part 2, the second prong about people pursuing the social justice through, it was about people obeying laws. It was the first one. So he had mentioned a case about a parent might have a good reason to send their child to a private school, but he thinks that in reality, there's a good case for social justice to be made by outlawing private schools. So that's the reference.
Yeah. So on that note, so one thing I worry about that, I'll ask you about this in a second, is if there's this great argument for it, well, can we see it? Like maybe he makes it elsewhere. He doesn't make it in that chapter. It's sort of like the argument's in the pocket, right? Like, and I'm not going to show it to you, but just so you know I have it. But the other thing is, Ilya Somin wrote a book about democratic ignorance and was talking about a point like this. And it turns out empirically that, as far as we can tell, the schools that are best at teaching students civics in the way that Brighouse thinks of civics, this kind of narrow political participation and so on, are the Catholic schools. Empirically, it turns out that students who go to Catholic schools, regardless of what demographics they have, whether they're rich or poor or whatever, they end up being sort of better at participating and have more civics knowledge and background political knowledge than other kinds of students. So it almost looks like, this is why I brought this up, because it almost looks like, well, if you care about these goals that Brighouse has, then rather than just assuming public schools are the vehicle by which to deliver it, you might look and ask, well, what actually is good at delivering it? It turns out it might not be public schools. It turns out it looks like it's Catholic schools.
Right.
But further, beyond that point, this is important to him. It's not just that public schools should do these things, but he's worried that private schools are bad. And there's a lot of questions I have about this, which is, one is like, I have 2 children. How much am I required to sacrifice their interests in order to benefit other children's interests?
Right.
Disadvantage them in order to help advantage disadvantaged kids.
Right.
Further, I wonder, presumably the argument on behalf of getting rid of private schools is something like this. If you have like high human capital, high income parents, high social capital parents, they're transmitting certain values to their kids, and human capital and social capital to their kids. And if those kids all escape to private schools, then they sort of share their capital with one another. And the kids who are growing up with poorer parents who lack human and social capital aren't getting the benefit of mixing with those students. And if you mix them all together, what happens? You transfer some of that capital to these other kids. Maybe that's true, but it's not. I don't know. Like, I want to see empirical evidence. Like, does putting higher achieving kids in with lower achieving kids make the lower achieving kids higher achieving? It seems to me like it's an empirical question. It's the kind of thing that educational psychologists can study. I assume they have studied it. There's a literature on it. I just don't know what that literature is.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that literature too much myself. But the question obviously that you bring up also is, let's say that it's true. Let's say that putting higher income kids in, presuming that they're higher achieving kids, whatever, in with an assortment of other kids will bring up the level. The question still is, how much obligation do I have personally to sacrifice potentially a better education that I could get maybe at a private school? This is just for the sake of argument, as opposed to sending my kids to a public school so that everyone else can benefit from my child's presence.
Yeah. Imagine you've just been admitted to college and you got into, say, Princeton. Then your parents said to you, I don't think you should go to Princeton. I think you should go to name some like very small community college with disadvantaged students, because then the students there will get to hang out with you and you'll help them by virtue of them being exposed to you. That's kind of what they're asking for. And it's interesting because the egalitarian mindset does lead to this sort of worry. Recently there was an article in the news based upon this British philosopher who was worried, like, when I read to my children at night, I'm helping to make them more advantaged than the kids who aren't getting read to by their parents. And similarly, my children have a larger vocabulary than most children of their age, because they're exposed, like, my wife has a master's degree and they're exposed to more words and we talk more. So we're advantaging them already. There are all these studies showing that by the time kids get into kindergarten, they're already kind of set with some being advantaged and some being disadvantaged. So if you've got this egalitarian mindset that we have to worry about how private schools help the advantage, well, there are all sorts of other things we do that already help people to be advantaged before they get into school. There's one other worry I have about this, and it's an economic worry when people complain about private versus public schooling. It has to do with what actually leads to quality in the world. So one thing economists know, and this is going to be familiar to readers, to your viewers, is that monopolies are bad. Like when you want bad quality, one of the best ways to get bad quality in something is to have a monopoly provider. So what Brighouse is doing is asking us to have a monopoly provider, though he's saying, well, we'll all have a voice in how the monopoly provider of education. The state will provide the education for you. You go to the school your state tells you to. And it won't be a terrible monopoly, of course, because you have the right to vote and you can complain about it. But it's not clear that actually matters that much. And one way to illustrate that is with a thought experiment. And let's involve restaurants. Suppose that in one town, this town has one restaurant. Everyone is required to eat every single meal at that restaurant. However, they're free to complain to the management as much as they want to about the quality of the food. In the second town, it has many, many restaurants. Everyone can eat wherever they want, but they're never, ever allowed to complain. Now, if it's just basic economics that the second town is going to have much better quality restaurants than the first town, and the reason is because competition and the power to exit does a lot more to improve quality than having a monopoly provider, no power to exit, and having the power of voice.
Right.
So I think what he would want is, even if he cares about public education, what he wants is a competitive system of public education where people have a lot of right to exit their current system and go in search of the better school, and the schools, in a sense, have to compete to get the students,
right,
rather than the kind of typical public education we have in the U.S., which is you go to the school in your neighborhood. That's that.
Right. Yeah. There's also a diversity concern there, especially because Brighouse in a previous chapter, like I said, really wants schools to be really diverse and places where people can see a whole lot of different ways of life. So you brought up the studies about Catholic education. I've seen the same studies that it seems like citizenship education is at least as good, if not better, pretty consistently than public education. One of the theories about why that is because Catholic schools are pretty homogenous in terms of the people who go there kind of sign on to a particular mission statement. You don't go to a Catholic school unless you're either in agreement with or not opposed to the mission statement that the Catholic school has. So what happens is that the Catholic school doesn't really have to worry about watering down anything that might be potentially controversial in the same way that a public school that takes kids from all over the religious, ideological, political, social spectrum would have to. So one of the things I worry about with the idea that Brighouse has that social justice requires, let's say, banning private education, is that in some ways, the idea that he has about banning education and having public ed in this diverse place is going to undermine the school's ability to teach certain things that may be controversial. Everyone's going to be a public reason liberal because no one wants to offer an argument that could be rejected by someone with a different religious persuasion. But when you're in a school where everyone has roughly a similar political or religious persuasion, you can do a lot more and you can do it with more enthusiasm. Catholics, for instance, place a very important priority on the virtue of charity and helping the poor. So they can be really enthusiastic about teaching this as a civic virtue. Whereas in a public school, I mean, obviously you're still going to teach that charity is a virtue, but you might not do it as enthusiastically as you do in that Catholic school where all of the students have kind of presumably signed on to the Catholic school's mission statement.
Yeah, that's right.
So yeah, it's, I mean, there's obviously a lot to talk about with this book, and I'm pretty sure my students will kind of profit from really thinking about this, because I think you're right that for whatever reason, maybe it's because it's a book geared towards a lay public that's 115 pages. Dr. Brighouse maybe doesn't argue as much in certain places where maybe he would if it were an academic paper, but it's really important to flesh out some of these disagreements. So yeah, I'll leave it to obviously my students and whoever's viewing this video to decide where they stand. And if they haven't read Brighouse's book, hopefully they do. And if they haven't read some of your books, hopefully they pick those up as well. I think the one of your books that's closest related to the chapter we've been talking about, obviously, is the ethics of voting, where you have some similar things to say about, epistemic virtue in voting and things like that. So Dr. Brennan, I thank you very much for your time today. It's been a great discussion.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Sure.